The gold is black, a foot deep. It abounds with good springs, which is our drink. Of beasts I have seen deer, raccoons, squirrels. Of birds diversely feathered there are infinite numbers. By all which it appeareth the country aboundeth not only with profit, but with pleasure. And to say truth, there wanteth nothing for perfecting of this hopeful plantation, but greater numbers of our countrymen to enjoy it. St. Mary's, Maryland, May 27th, 1634.
As the New World continued to make Spain the richest and most powerful nation in Europe, other European nations desired their own share of the New World and began to colonize the Americas. Colonization of the North American coast in the 17th and 18th centuries would forever change the land, the Native Americans who lived there, and the European colonists themselves. In the 1500s, Northern European sailors crossed the North Atlantic in growing numbers. North America may not have had gold, but it did have fish and fur. Fish provided cheap animal protein. Beaver hats and furs were so popular that Western Europeans had hunted many fur-bearing animals to extinction. But in North America, beaver numbered in the millions.
And one of the things that they wanted to do was to set up trading stations with the Indians, because there was value in what the forests had. The forest had pelts, the forest had skins from animals, and there was a demand for that in Europe. But the French also thought that not only would the trade bring profit, but it might actually help to pay for settlement. And they looked upon these trading posts as the first step in creating a new France in America.
The French had been exploring North America for 80 years before they set up their first permanent trading posts on the St. Lawrence River in the early 1600s. Very quickly, they established a lucrative trade with the Algonquins and the Hurons, who controlled eastern Canada. Farther down the North American coast, the Dutch set up their own trading posts on the Hudson River. The New Netherlands colony on Manhattan Island grew quickly on the profits from its fur trade with the Iroquois nations. Native Americans were eager to acquire the Europeans' metal tools and weapons, alcohol, and trading goods.
You do get dependent upon things. If indeed it is easier to make arrows out of metal rather than chipping away at it, over a period of time you're going to forget how it is to chip away at it, and you're going to need and have only that metal. And in order to have access to those European goods, they needed to continue to find more pelts and more skins, and they began to use up their resources to kill all the beaver where they were, kill all the deer, and have to go farther and farther inland, which meant, of course, they might bump into other Indians, and Indian wars would start with one another, which would hurt the Indians.
The Beaver Wars, which began in the 1640s, didn't end until the Iroquois had wiped out the Huron and emerged as the most powerful of the eastern woodland nations. But trading goods wasn't all the Europeans brought.
Disease spread over the people as great destruction. Very many died of it. They could not stir. They could not change positions. And if they stirred, much did they cry out.
One of the biggest problems that Native Americans had was the introduction of diseases for which they really had no immunity. And the big disease problems they had in North America, for example, would be influenza, would be measles, would be smallpox. And the effect that it had on the Indians, besides killing them or besides weakening them, is that they lost confidence in themselves. And the effect it could have on Europeans is that it seemed another reinforcement of their own superiority.
Epidemics swept up and down the North American coast every few years, weakening or wiping out whole tribes and leaving their land ripe for the taking. Ready to step into the void were the colonists from the British Isles, seeking both religious freedom and riches. A small island nation off the coast of Western Europe, England had grown strong under King Henry VIII and his daughter, Queen Elizabeth. By the late 16th century, England was eager to establish its own foothold in the New World. England's first North American colony, Roanoke, disappeared without a trace in the 1580s. In 1606, a group of English businessmen set up the Virginia Company of London and sent out 105 men and boys in search of gold. They settled on a swampy peninsula in a place they named Jamestown after their monarch, King James.
It's as if we all were shot into outer space and landed on a new planet and then said, here you are. They had to start over again, build shelter, plant food, gather food, build schools and churches. They had to live very primitively. Of course, there were plentiful deer and other animals to be shot, and fish in the waters. So they were not on a desert. There was a lot around them, but they had to start from the very beginning.
For several decades, the colony held on by its fingernails. When they weren't fighting among themselves, the early colonists suffered from malnutrition and disease during what became known as the starving time. But newcomers continued to arrive from England, lured by the hopes of making quick money.
Loving and kind mother and father, this is to let you understand that I, your child, am in a most heavy case, by reason that the nature of the country is such that it causeth much sickness, as maketh the body very poor and weak. We must work hard, both early and late, for a mess of water gruel and a mouthful of bread. We live in fear of the enemy every hour, for our plantation is very weak by reason of the death and sickness of our company.
Facing certain death from starvation, the Jamestown colonists had only survived with the help of the local Powhatan tribes, who traded corn and foodstuffs to the colonists in return for knives and guns.
The most famous story here, of course, has to do with Pocahontas and John Smith, and how she supposedly throws herself on top of John Smith and keeps the Indians from lopping his head off. And that was a symbolic act, but it is very suggestive of the dependence that the English had on the Indians, because the English could have been destroyed at the back of a hand if they had wanted to do it.
Like the Iroquois, the Powhatans hoped to use the Europeans to their advantage in their wars with the neighboring tribes.
They didn't appreciate that helping the English would spell their doom.
Unable to find gold, the Jamestown colony was on the edge of oblivion when colonist John Rolfe planted some West Indian tobacco seeds and discovered they would grow in the Virginia tidewater. The Jamestown colonists grew 20,000 pounds in 1618. In 1630, 500,000.
Why was the King of England so opposed to tobacco when it was becoming Virginia's cash crop? He called it the stinking weed, or it was sometimes called sotweed. And he wrote this little pamphlet called Counterblast to Tobacco. And darned if he doesn't sound like our Surgeon General. He said tobacco was loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs.
Despite their monarch's objection to tobacco, the English couldn't get enough of the stuff. As the profits from tobacco soared, English colonists poured into the Chesapeake and pushed onto Indian lands. Angered by the land-hungry colonists and their assaults on Indian villages, the Powhatan chief Opechancanough attacked the Virginia settlements in 1622 and nearly destroyed Jamestown. The survivors responded with equal ferocity. Over the following decades, Virginia's Indian population was ravaged by war and disease. At the same time, the English population grew rapidly as settlers poured into Virginia and Maryland, established in 1632 as a refuge for English Catholics being persecuted at home.
That old expression, gold, gospel, and glory, pretty much sums up the motives for settlement in the New World. Everyone who came to America from Europe hoped somehow to improve the qualities of their lives, whether spiritually or materially.
England had an official state church headed by the king. Some English Protestants, called Puritans, thought it was too corrupt and worldly and wanted to reform or purify it. Another smaller and more radical group of Puritans, called Separatists, broke from the church altogether. In November 1620, about 100 people, including 30 religious separatists, arrived at Cape Cod on the coast of modern-day Massachusetts. These are the people who we know as the Pilgrims. A pilgrim is a person who makes a journey for religious reasons. Fearing the corrupting influences and harassment at home, these pilgrims had come to the wilderness to start over and build up a community based on their beliefs. In 1630, a much larger group of about 1,000 Puritans settled a few miles north of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts Bay. They too had come to create a new society based on Christian principles, as Puritan leader John Winthrop explained.
The end is to improve our lives and do more service to the Lord and comfort and increase the body of Christ, whereof we are members, that ourselves and posterity may be better preserved from the common corruptions of this evil world, to serve the Lord and work out our salvation under the power and purity of his holy ordinance. We shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us.
The Puritans believed that God had chosen them to redeem Christianity and to serve as a religious model to the world. And to ensure the success of their holy mission, the Puritans made a covenant or agreement with God that ruled every part of their lives.
They meant to purify society by coming to America when they didn't think they could do it in England anymore and live a pure life here. I think the simplest way to think of them are people who organize their lives around three things: religion, family, and community.
The Puritans came with their families. The family was the foundation of the Puritan covenant, the mother hive out of which both the swarms of state and church issued forth.
Within the Puritan society, no one was to live alone because the idea was that you needed to have other people watch over you, both watch over your safety, but also watch over your behavior.
No bachelors, no single women. Everyone had to live within a family. If they didn't have their own family, they had to live in someone else's family. No singles in Puritan Massachusetts.
Puritan society was patriarchal, that is, governed by men. The father ruled his family, controlling both their economic and religious affairs. The Puritan wife and mother lived under her husband's control, giving up her property and legal rights to her husband when she married.
The woman was thought to be subordinate to the man. A woman, even before she was married, could never travel by herself or really be in public alone. She had to be with a brother, a father, or a husband.
The woman's role was to run the home and garden, and most importantly, to bear children. And when the father failed to maintain a peaceful and religious household, the community reserved the right both to excommunicate the father from the church and to take the children from the family for placement in a foster home.
What was it like to be a child in a Puritan family? It was certainly to learn obedience from the earliest years. The Puritans believed you had to break the will of a child. When that little baby learned to walk and learned to talk and exhibit its own will and a bit of stubbornness, it was thought you had to deal with that child very severely.
You spanked them a lot, and you shamed them a lot, and you taught them a lot about sin as early as you could, and you made them understand that they were responsible, that their behavior could bring down God's wrath on the whole community, that they were responsible to and for the family and the group around them. It was a pretty heavy trip to lay on a kid.
Massachusetts was so concerned about disobedience in children that by the 1640s they passed a disobedient child law which said that a child who sassed its parents and would not obey was liable to capital punishment. Now, the Puritans did not kill any children for being disobedient, but they did put a law on the books to that effect, to warn kids.
Childhood in Puritan New England usually ended around ages 10 to 12, when most children were sent to live with other families as indentured servants or apprentices. Not only did these placements enable children to learn a trade, but they believed that such foster families would better impose the strict discipline necessary to raise a child.